I'm Daniel Hurwitz, the director of the Institute for the Humanities, and I'm thrilled that you've showed up after an astonishing, really wonderful 3.5-hour concert last night. I'm thrilled that you've made it up. I want to thank all the composers from that concert. It was just extraordinary. A lot of the music I had never had the chance to hear myself, and I was really totally blown away and moved and fascinated and astonished, if you will, by the ongoing vitality of all that stuff. It just struck me as fresh today, like maybe it would have been 50 years ago. Today we have a day of reflection and also a discussion in the afternoon. When Michael Doherty came to me 2 years ago from the composition department at School of Music, Theater, and Dance here at University of Michigan, and suggested that we really must mark in a fitting way, an interesting way, worthy way, the 50th anniversary of a major event in the history of modern avant-garde music, in the history of music that took place right here in Ann Arbor. And we talked about how we might do that. Three things became immediately clear. The first was that the music had to come back. We had to restage the festival. It had to be reperformed, and that would allow one the sense to experience those sounds now, and whatever reflection wanted to take place about once had to take place through the apparatus of the ear and not just the frontal lobe, if you will, insofar as those can be distinguished. People had to hear the stuff first. Second thing is, we had to bring the composers back. We wanted to hear their voices. We wanted them to be part of it. We wanted them to talk about how the music sounds to them now, what it was like then, a lot of different things. And that panel will happen this afternoon from 2 to 4. Everybody, I'm sure, will be there then and more. And the third thing that we wanted to have happen was that there should be a reflection about the intervening space between once then and once now. The word once is such a fascinating word. If I could do a riff on it, not at all necessarily what was meant then. Once is an extraordinary thing because it suggests the unrepeatable. It's happened once. Maybe it'll never happen again, maybe it will. It suggests the invitation to contingency, to experiment, the invitation to the openness of something happening at a particular moment in time that might never happen again, and that one can live with that. It suggests an existential moment. It suggests the excitement of the event itself, if you will, of every event that is such an event, which after all only happens once. And of course, that meant that there was some of the buoyancy, the excitement, the innovation associated with the best of avant-garde sensibilities. The sense that the future was there to be staked in the present, and if the present fell away, so be it. One had to move on, and one would move on. But of course, that is now once, meaning once upon a time, once in the past. And the space of 50 years has been a vast one. So when the music comes back, it comes back across an ocean of distance. And I thought I'd just mention a couple of things about that ocean of distance, how they figure in how one thinks about the music today. I leave to your imaginations. I make no comment about that, but there certainly has been an ocean, and I thought I'd briefly mention it before introducing the proper symposius today. At least three things have happened that everybody knows about, and I will just remind you of them. The first has been the globalization of sound. Since 1960, Indian music, African music, in minimalism, Steve Reich, Japanese music, now everybody writes string quartets with koto and this and that and so forth. And increasingly with the globalization of sound, which has of course been part of the globalization of markets, sound has been increasingly commodified, as if it's a kind of department store for various kinds of composers to choose from. As sound becomes commodified, music becomes increasingly profiled rather than invented or experiment, making it increasingly difficult for that buoyancy of attitude, that sense of staking a festival on innovation, to happen today. And so that's one thing, the intervening space. The second thing about that intervening space, of course, has to do with new digital technologies. One of the wondrous things about some of the pieces last night was to realize how sophisticated electronic sound was already when it was being done then. But of course, there have been oceans of distance, and not just about new technologies. And I'm very happy to say that the School of Music Technology here is going to be doing 2 days of wonderful concerts, Friday and Saturday. Everybody must come, in which our wonderful composers like Eric Santos and others will be performing music that they have done in a way as a legacy of once, using new technologies and so forth. But I'm not just talking about the development of instrumentation. engineering instruments and so on and so forth. I'm talking about new platforms like the internet, websites, blogs, YouTube, the way in which sound filters increasingly in this new life. As everybody knows, the music industry is in a danger of collapse because of copyright and circulation and all these kinds of things which have a vast effect on the fate of music. In particular, it's increasingly bereft of the spontaneity of performance and increasingly happening through circulation, repetition, blog, website, and so forth. These new platforms have also made it at once an opportunity but also a difficulty to retrieve and retain the kind of innovation that one thinks of as central to the Once Festival then. The third thing I wanted to mention was, of course, the festival itself as a modern institution. The festival is now something that you read about in the New York Times travel section. Summer festivals in Cologne and here and there, and Bard College and wonderful places. But the festival is part of tourism. It's part of the market economy. It's part of restaurants and new cuisine and hearing Wagner for the 18,000th time and things of this nature. And that means increasingly the festival has been bereft of innovation, experimentation, confraternity, avant-garde movement, all the things that made the Once Festival so great. And so, to a certain extent, it will be interesting to think about the stakes of retrieving the Once Festival as a beacon for the future, harder and harder to maintain today, as opposed to some moment of nostalgia or remembrance or something like that. It seems to me the really interesting moral thing is to think about what it means to try and retain some of those values about which the Once Festival are iconic or exemplary in this new world economy in which musicians are composing and performing and so on and so forth. We're going to have fantastic speakers today, 4 of them. Before, in the afternoon from 2 to 4, we have the composers themselves speaking. I'm going to introduce 2 at a time because our format's going to be that 2 speakers will speak for half an hour each, then we'll have some discussion, a break, and then another 2. The first 2 speakers, our 4 speakers, of course, are Marjorie Perloff, Nancy Perloff, Lita Miller, and Rich Crawford. The first 2 speakers who we're going to have are Lita Miller and Nancy Perloff, and that's absolutely wonderful. Lita Miller is, of course, an absolute must. She, as everybody knows, wrote the 100-page booklet accompanying the CD. She is really, to a certain extent, the archivist, the historian, the interpreter of the Once Festival, possibly uniquely, actually. Her books on Lou Harrison and American music are legendary and fantastic. Her sense of the scope and power of modern American music is pretty much unrivaled. She is professor of music at UC Santa Cruz, where I know you've been a close associate of Gordon Mumma when he was there as well, right? Originally, Lita Miller was trained as Gordon told me this is a CPE Bach scholar, right? And is also a well-known performing flutist. Which is also a great thing. So that she will be the first speaker. There's more about her in the catalog. As you all know, everybody has the catalog. The second speaker will be Nancy Perloff, who we have also invited as Mellon Visiting Fellow for the week. She's also given a wonderful lecture yesterday about the Russian avant-garde book. Nancy Perloff is somebody I've known for a very long time and is a great friend of mine. I'm proud of it. She is a Michigan girl, if I may put it that way. She has a PhD. She worked with Rich Crawford even and others in the School of Music here. She has a PhD in musicology from the University of Michigan, where she worked on Satie and wrote a magnificent book on Eric Satie and turn of the century French music. She then went to UCLA after some teaching and other things and got an MA in art history. She's one of the few people I know who is doubly trained across multimedia. She occupies the position of curator and archivist at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles, where she has mounted extraordinary exhibitions of Russian avant-garde materials. She mounted a whole complicated set of events around David Tudor's music and archives. She has been involved in the collecting and building of archives at the Getty, but not just that, visual and musical archives, but also she is uniquely able to track the multimedia nature of a lot of modernist materials, and if you think of Donald Scavarda's work yesterday and so forth, it's evident that some of the things that were pertain to the Once Festival call for that kind of analysis. So our first two speakers will be first Lita Miller and then Nancy Perloff, and may I welcome then, as soon as I thank three people also. Three people do have to be thanked. The first is Doretha Koval, who from the Institute has done the most marvelous job in arranging everything. This has been a very complicated set of procedures between UMS, School of Music, Art and Design, Music Technology, with people coming and going, lots of changes, taping and so forth. She's been marvelous in orchestrating it. The second one is Amanda Krugliak, our curator, who put together with Laura Kuhn, who is also a visiting fellow with us and will be speaking in the Penny Stamps Lecture Art and Design on Thursday, as everybody knows, put together the John Cage Sound installation, which is a collateral event that's part of this festival as well, in the Institute's gallery. Please come and see it, the lecture on the weather. So Amanda also must be thanked. And the third one is, of course, Michael Doherty, without whom not. It was Michael who carried the mission of this, who generated the mission of this, and who has been, I've never seen somebody send emails at 2 in the morning every night consistently, making sure that everything was happening. To a certain extent, he's the Wagner of this whole thing. You know, so let's just thank him too. All right, Lita Miller.
Before I begin, I just want to say that I'm both honored and humbled by this invitation to speak to you today about Once. I was too young to be present at the Once festivals, and my involvement stems from my long-term friendship and professional association with my dear friend and colleague Gordon Muma, who graciously provided me with many of the photographs that you'll see today. And when I began my research, I knew about Once only in the most general sense, but through the cooperation, the wonderful cooperation of all the founders and many others associated with the festivals, I soon became quite familiar with all the details. So I want to thank Bob Ashley, Don Scavarda, Roger Reynolds, Gordon Muma, and many, many others. And of course, Daniel Hurwitz for inviting me, and Doretha Koval for the extraordinary logistical support that I've had. So, to begin.
Lady?
Yes.
If you're going to read a lot, would you lower the microphone? So you
Yes, it seems too loud.
Just pull it down, so you don't go off the mic when you read. Yeah, there you go.
It doesn't seem to be moving. Oh, it's that one? Okay.
Just push it down.
It's both.
Yeah, I pushed it down, but it pops back up. Okay, I'll stand back.
Sounds like you're in a-
No, that should be good.
Okay. Thanks, Brian.
There you go.
So, the population of Ann Arbor in 1960 was about 68,000, of which nearly half were students at the University of Michigan. Detroit, on the other hand, was the 5th largest city in the nation, a vibrant metropolis of about 1.7 million with a rich cultural fabric, including a thriving network of amateur and professional orchestras. Gordon Muma played French horn in 5 different orchestras while he was still in high school. Equally removed from the Eastern centers whose artists pride themselves on setting the pulse of the nation, and from the West Coast, which flaunts its nonconformist reputation, Ann Arbor in 1960 would seem an unlikely place to shake up the new music world, and yet in the early 60s it did just that, by playing host to one of the most extraordinary adventures in U.S. music history, the annual Once festivals, and a broad nexus of related events. Here's their most famous, or should we say infamous, brochure, the program for the 1964 festival. In part, Once was fostered by the cultural richness of Michigan at the time, and naturally by the resources at the university, which offered and still offers vibrant composition program and a reservoir of very talented performers. In part, it arose in sympathy, or at least in parallel, with the political climate in the town. Ann Arbor was a hotbed of radical activity. a center for left-wing activism, a hub for the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. The Students for a Democratic Society took shape in Ann Arbor in 1960, the same year that plans developed for the first Once Festival. But mostly, Once arose from the fortuitous and really quite coincidental intersection of a group of enterprising young composers: Robert Ashley, Gordon Muma, Roger Reynolds, Don Scavarda, and George Cachopo. Once, of course, took place more than once. The center of activity was the annual festival, which the composers mounted in February to March each year from 1961 through 1965. This slide summarizes the programming for the first 3 years. By 1965, the Once festivals had garnered such renown that the organizers expanded with a second festival. The Once Again performance you see listed at the bottom of this slide was held in September that year on the roof of a parking garage. And it featured, along with the Once group, the Judson Dance Group from New York, and John Cage's Talk One. Cage talked with Robert Rauschenberg and Ashley, while David Tudor and Muma modified the conversations electronically. During these first 5 years, Once presented on its annual festivals 170 works by 92 composers, most of whom were on the cutting edge of the international and national new music scene. Thereafter, Once's activities continued through 1969, often featuring the Once Group, which was a cross-disciplinary association of artists who specialized in multimedia theatrical events. But the annual festivals were really only the tip of the iceberg. Ancillary events sprouted within and outside the community. Once Friends, Once Removed, once a month, once off. Performances took place in Detroit, in Cape Cod, Toronto, Richmond, St. Louis, Hartford, Boston, New York. Teams of Once participants made guest appearances nationally and internationally, among them Ashley and Muma's Music for Pianos series, nearly 24 concerts from Los Angeles to Rome, 1962 through 1967. Other local composers active at various times included Bruce Wise, Sherman Van Solchem, Robert Sheff, Philip Crum, and many, many others. Well, how did this extraordinary outburst of creative and highly original activity take shape? The purpose of my talk today is to provide some background for the genesis of Once, as well as to give you a small taste of some of the music, some of which you already heard last night. To begin, let's see how the meeting of these 5 principles came about, and in contrast to the normal procedure, I'll begin backwards chronologically. When Once began in 1961, Roger Reynolds was just beginning his compositional career. After completing in May 1957 a bachelor's degree in engineering physics, Reynolds worked for a few months as a systems development engineer at the Marquardt Ramjet Corporation in Van Nuys, California. But he found himself spending most of his time practicing the piano at the local Unitarian church. Later in 1957, he returned to the University of Michigan and he entered the bachelor's program in music. His mentor was a young assistant professor, not so young in this photograph, H. Wiley Hitchcock, who guided Reynolds through an honors degree program that allowed him to study independently with various faculty members. I was trying to establish for myself a certain repertoire, said Reynolds, writing pieces for different ensembles to develop a body of work. Here's a short example from his Epigram and Evolution, played by Ashley, and it's a live recording from the 1961 festival, and hopefully it will work. impressive repertoire establishing work. I think you'll agree. And equally impressive is Ashley's performance. As you can hear, he is, if you're still playing, an outstanding pianist. In 1952, Ashley had completed, let's go back to that timeline, Ashley had completed a bachelor's degree in music theory at the University of Michigan and then a master's at the Manhattan School 2 years later. In 1956, he returned to Ann Arbor with the aim of entering the composition doctoral program, but, quote, I got kicked out 3 times. 3 times I brought in a piece and they said it's not playable, so I finally gave up. Interested in technology, Ashley sought out an electronic music studio. But the only thing I found was the so-called Speech Research Institute funded by Bell Labs, he recalled. Director Gordon Peterson allowed Ashley to work at the Institute as a special student for 3 years, helping a doctoral student investigate the causes of stuttering. When his mentor was hired by the University of Pittsburgh, he offered Ashley the project for his own thesis, and Peterson was ready to schedule oral exams. This path would have led to a teaching career, but Ashley declined. You were very generous to me, he said to Peterson, but I promised myself that I would be a composer. Many of Ashley's works, as you no doubt know, are intimately linked to speech, and among the many examples that could be cited is the 4th of July, which featured the sounds of his neighbor's Independence Day party, gradually accompanied by and then overwhelmed by electronic sounds. Here's the program from the first one's festival, and you'll see that the 4th of July ended the second concert immediately following the Reynolds work that we just heard. Here's a small example from that piece. Interdisciplinary interest, and particularly his collaborations with his filmmaker friend George Montepelli, whom he had met in New York, led him to interactions with faculty in art and architecture. Shortly after arriving in Ann Arbor, Ashley met Milton Cohen, a faculty member in the art department who had developed a space theater. More about this later. Working with Cohen at the time was Gordon Muma, who provided electronic music for Cohen's light shows. Muma, as he tells it, was, quote, booted out of high school during his senior year in 1951, when the orchestra teacher discovered him and his friends playing jazz instead of Haydn during a sectional rehearsal. She cursed the genre as, quote, that nigger music. And she sent Muma to the principal's office. Muma stormed out of the school, taking a door off its hinges on the way out. The enlightened principal, however, facilitated his entrance to the University of Michigan in 1952 without a completed diploma. 2 years earlier, Professor Rossley Finney had judged a high school composition contest in which Muma's string quartet took first prize. Thus, Finney welcomed Muma into the music department. But soon they began to bump heads. Even Finney's strongest defenders acknowledged that he could be occasionally quite abrasive. He could be imperious, said Reynolds, though you knew in your heart that what he said was right. The final straw for Muma was when Finney crumpled up one of Muma's manuscripts and threw it out the window of his 8th floor office. Muma left music for a literature major and after 2 years dropped out of the university entirely. Even so, Finney welcomed him to attend graduate seminars and what he called his monthly Symposiums, where student works were performed and critiqued. Meanwhile, Muma wrote music for plays, where he first encountered reel-to-reel tape recorders, and teaching himself electronics from books, he began to conduct experiments in electronic music. Muma and Ashley had crossed paths briefly as undergraduates in 1952, so when Ashley joined Cohen's enterprise 5 years later, the two men began to collaborate, forming the Cooperative Studio for Electronic Music. We'll now hear an excerpt from Muma's piece, Meanwhile a Two-Piece, for two players and magnetic tape performed on the 1962 festival by Muma on French horn and percussion and Ashley on piano and percussion. The piece requires both players to move around on the stage among four instrumental groupings. Well, we can't see the colors too well, but as shown on this floor plan by dotted boxes and highlighted on the slide, sort of. And the player at position 3, Muma on French horn, reads his score from left to right. Pitches are fixed, but rhythm and all other elements are variable, and the scores at the other three stations are read vertically. They show the density of events, but pitches, rhythms, and so on are chosen in response to the tape part. When each player completes the first line or column, he walks to another station, indicated by the large circled number at the end of the line or column, a process that prompted delighted laughter from the audience. Obviously a live recording from the performance. While still in high school, Muma had performed with the Royal Oak Symphony an overture that George Cacioppo had composed for his master's thesis in 1951. Here's a brief excerpt from the beginning. This is a recording of the live performance in 1952. Later, Cacioppo began experimenting with novel notation, such as his Cassiopeia, which we heard last night, and I think a version of this slide was shown there. The performer is authorized to move from any pitch shown here to any other one connected to it. Well, in 1952, the same year in which Ashley completed his bachelor's degree and Muma entered the university, Don Scavarda completed his master's degree in composition. Here he is, with Ashley and Bruce Wise. In April 1962, Scavarda began coaching his ping pong partner, clarinetist John Morgan, in extended instrumental techniques, including significantly multiphonics. Scavarda saw compositional potential in these squeaks and bleeps that performers called errors, and he worked with Morgan for 6 intensive weeks to control them. Scavarda then organized these sounds into a matrix of 36 squares, many of which specify alternative fingerings. Here's a few of the squares. The performer may play them in any order, repeating or omitting them at will. And let's listen to a very brief example from Morgan's performance of this piece. Matrix was a pioneering, even quite revolutionary work. As far as we can tell, the first published composition specifying clarinet multiphonics. Oops, sorry. Hearing the Reynolds piece again. It preceded by 5 years Bruno Bartolozzi's well-known book, New Sounds for Woodwinds. In 1964, a performance of Matrix was included on Advanced Recordings' album, New Music for Clarinet. And that recording, along with a review of it, led to intense demand for the score. Within a decade, woodwind players throughout the country were experimenting with multiphonics. Well, by 1959, several of these men found themselves, quote, withering on the vine creatively, in Scavarda's words, because of a lack of opportunity to hear their music performed. Scavarda and Cacioppo had recently returned to Ann Arbor after several years away, Cacioppo in Monroe, Michigan, and Scavarda on a Fulbright in Germany, and both began to work in the university's doctoral program. Ashley was working at the speech lab, which provided some intellectual stimulus, and the post office, which didn't. Muma was working as a medical orderly. Scavarda discussed with a doctoral student, George Crum, the concept of, quote, doing public concerts not affiliated with the university, but he said the time was just not right. But several events in 1960 suddenly made the time right. One was the residency in Ann Arbor of Spanish, later British, composer Roberto Girard, who replaced Finney when he went on sabbatical during the spring semester. Girard was wide open, said Muma, enthusiastic about differences. Reynolds characterized him as intellectually deep, emotionally responsive, enormously capable. Scavarda says succinctly, Girard was the catalyst. Back to that timeline again. In August 1960, an international conference of composers attracted 50 delegates from 20 countries to Stratford, Ontario. 4 of the once founders went there, anxious to meet seminal figures in the new music world. But the delegates were sheltered, said Reynolds. The moments at which we might have been able to walk up to them and speak were somehow closeted off. On the way home in the car, I think it was probably Bob who said, we could do a better festival than that, and the rest of us agreed. And so the plan hatched right there in the car. The only delegate who responded to the students' outreach was Luciano Berio, who had given a lecture demonstration in Ann Arbor that spring. Similar ideas occurred to several of us around the same time, said Muma, who remembers poet Keith Waldrop suggesting a concert series. Scavarda remembers a meeting of 8 composers in the summer of 1960, the 5 principals plus Weiss and Van Solkema and Gregory Kostek, at which they evaluated works ready for performance. They had enough material for 2 programs, and so they began to plan. Other activities, such as Cohn's Space Theater, also helped build the momentum for once. A painter interested in light art, Cohn had joined the University of Michigan faculty in 1957 and soon hooked up with architecture graduate student, later professor, Harold Borken, shown, yes, here, on the far left. Soon thereafter, architecture instructor Joseph Ware joined them. In a rented studio space, Cohn and Borken built a 20-sided hemisphere in which they installed light projectors and a complex array of mirrors. Ashley described to me some of the more humorous effects of the rotating projections. There was a ball with front surface mirrors glued all over it, and they had a rack of slides. Cohn had a beautiful picture of a cow. I'll never forget that damn cow. You'd look up and the cow would be on the ceiling, and then the cow would be over there, and if you spun the ball, the cow would go around the room. I loved that cow. Slides and films by Manapelli were projected onto rectangular panels. Cohn began presenting public shows, accompanied by Muma and Ashley's music, which was largely live electronics. Muma attached transducers to various sound sources, such as toy instruments and glass medical tubes filled with water, extending wires from them to a mixer. And he'd feed the mixer output to a tape recorder, and then he'd edit, reprocess, and modify the live sounds. He also experimented with modifying a sound's attack and attack and decay. When Ashley joined him, they also brought in an old piano which they took apart and played like a harp. On a grant from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, Cohn and Borken built a similar theater in an abandoned fire station in San Francisco in 1961. The endeavor established artistic links between the Ann Arbor composers and electronic music composers on the West Coast. The Space Theater was so successful that the group was invited by Luigi Nono to the Venice Biennale in September 1964, where they presented 3-hour-long shows. Well, the College of Architecture and Design also supported avant-garde music. For instance, on May 14, 1960, 3 months before that Stratford conference, Cage and Tudor appeared in the school's auditorium in a presentation of Cage's Indeterminacy. Cage read all 128 of his 1-minute stories, while Tudor provided electronic accompaniment. 2 days later, they gave a concert at Ann Arbor High School, supported in part by the community's Dramatic Arts Center, which I'll refer to as DAC. Reynolds, who had met Cage on one of his many trips to New York during the late 1950s, arranged for their Ann Arbor appearance. It was his close friend, musicology graduate student Sherman Van Solkema, however, who approached DAC on April 27, 1960, along with fellow graduate student Ed Coleman, to ask for financial sponsorship of this event. Here's a photo of Gerard with UM graduate students, including many of the familiar composers we've seen before, but I've circled Van Solkema and Coleman so you can spot them quickly. DAC allocated $200 for the Cage event. The driving financial force behind DAC was professor of mathematics, Wilfred Kaplan. He was also a pianist and violinist who had minored in music at Harvard. DAC had been founded in 1954 to establish a repertory theater in Ann Arbor, and the endeavor was successful for 3 years until the group lost its lease on the theater. Thereafter, DAC sponsored various artistic activities in the community. MUMA worked with DAC artists since the organization's inception, and here's a program from 1959 in which he provided sound effects. Well, during the 1960s, DAC presented 5 major events in the community each year, including the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, the Ann Arbor Film Festival, and Once. On October 16, 1960, Ashley and Reynolds approached DAC for support of a contemporary music festival. Here's the minutes from that meeting. They record that quote. You can see the squared part in red. Bob Ashley and Roger Reynolds presented plans for a contemporary music festival and asked the support of the DAC. A series of 6 concerts are planned. And later in the paragraph, the DAC agreed to underwrite $750 if the other $750 could be raised. DAC continued to provide funding for Once through most of its years of operation, but not much was needed. Income from the festival's mostly sold-out performances covered the major part of the expenses. Kaplan almost single-handedly covered the overrun on any DAC project, in part from the royalties on his influential calculus textbook. Reynolds also secured some financial support through Tanglewood connections. Members of the Once family soon became heavily involved in DAC's operation. Ashley served on its board beginning in 1962. MUMA's wife, Jackie, acted as its manager in 1962 through 3. Joseph Ware's wife, Anne, another DAC board member, was an actress and writer whose home was a mecca for visiting artists. She provided invaluable service by handling all of Once's logistics. Ashley acknowledges that the festival simply could not have happened without Anne Ware. The response of the university's music faculty was mixed. Reynolds and Ware recall Finney as supportive. And Finney himself wrote in his autobiography, "My contribution at the first festival was to persuade William Ravelli to allow the use of percussion instruments belonging to the university band. You can imagine my consternation when the percussionist used metal hammers on the marimba. Though I think perhaps it was really the vibraphone, which would have been somewhat less destructive, obviously." MUMA and Ashley, on the other hand, remember Finley as strongly opposed, especially in later years. To judge by the sold-out performances, the audience response was largely positive. The printed reviews, as expected, were more mixed. Among the reviewers from the university was musicology doctoral student Richard Crawford, whom you're going to hear from a little bit later this morning. Wiley Hitchcock reviewed the first festival for the Ann Arbor News, and he wrote an overview of the 1962 festival in Musical Quarterly. He praised Scavarda's groups, which we heard last night for piano, which was performed by Ashley, as tiny, tart, but tasty hors d'oeuvres. And the following year, Hitchcock called Ashley's works witty, forceful, and evocative in the extreme. Theory professor Paul Cooper was at times outraged. He called Lamont Young and Terry Riley Terry Jennings, excuse me, not Terry Riley, Terry Jennings, two overage juvenile delinquents. But he also balanced his criticism with praise. By 1964, Collins George, who regularly covered Once for the Detroit Free Press, summarized its heritage. While the festival, quote, has received its share of ridicule, indignation, and scorn, each year it seems to get stronger. Because among the, quote, musical moments of such absurdity as tossing a string bean in the air, the great majority of works have been of intense seriousness, some of true greatness. Muma characterized Once's aim as partly political. We were renegades, he told me over and over. Reynolds and Ashley have a somewhat different view. The fact that novelty tends to engender controversy does not necessarily mean that that's what the creator intended, said Reynolds. The once group theatrical events occasionally provoked negative responses. For example, a performance at Brandeis in which audience members threw onions, or a strange encounter at a conference of theoretical physicists when performers were physically assaulted and equipment was destroyed by irate delegates. But Ashley says the Once group's presentations were never designed to excite rebellion, but rather explore the intersections of theater, music, art, and film, and to push the boundaries of performance-audience interplay, a concept he explored in works such as Public Opinion Descends Upon the Demonstrators. In this piece, a sound controller responds directly to audience actions, such as whispering, gesturing, or leaving the auditorium. In 1962, Ashley, Borkin, and Ware proposed the establishment of a performance arts research laboratory, a space that artists could reconfigure to create varying relationships with the audience. An external advisory board of 14 artists from around the country convened for an initial meeting, but the project died from inadequate funding. Politics aside, the primary aim of Once's founders was to create a forum for the presentation of their own works and those of cutting-edge composers, and to this end they were phenomenally successful. Performers and composers within and outside Ann Arbor responded enthusiastically, agreeing to appear for very little or no remuneration. Surviving documents show that local performers got $1.50 per concert. The most significant legacy of Once, of course, is the new music created, pieces that are as diverse in style as they are compelling in expression. In Once's early years, this diversity was stably balanced on three legs: compositions for familiar instruments, though often played in non-familiar ways, electronic music, and works veering toward the theatrical. As the years progressed and various composers left or came to Ann Arbor, the orientation shifted decidedly toward the theatrical. By the later festivals, oral and visual elements were intricately interwoven. What united Once composers was their exploration of sound, whether through the medium of extended techniques on traditional instruments, electronic or electronically modified timbres, or the intersection of musical sounds with those of the environment. The realization of this quest produced works that explored individual pitches or aggregates extended in time, others in which alternative performance techniques define closed musical forms, those in which natural or electronic sounds interact, and still others in which the sound of everyday life impact the musical world. Above all, the Once phenomenon testifies to the productive and energizing power of community, the interactions and close cross-influences of the artists who created it, and the reactions of the patrons who attended its productions. As with any successful endeavor, Once evolved, its character shaped both by outside forces and its changing mix of personalities. But the organizers never lost sight of their original focus, to provide a forum for the latest trends in contemporary music. The artists enriched their community and in turn were stimulated by its response, whether supportive or critical. It's a rare creative artist who survives or even attempts to work in isolation from the world, wrote Gordon Muma in 1967. The greatest nourishment for the artist comes from the cultural community in which he lives, not only because that community is the consumer of his art, but because it reflects back to him the basis for his own artistic insights. Thank you.
This is a photo photograph of David Tudor performing at 9 Evenings Theater and Engineering, which was the very important event that was organized by Billy Kluver and Julie Martin by the organization Experiments in Art and Technology. And he's shown here playing the bandoneon, which is a concertina practiced in Argentina that actually I think he learned about from Mauricio Kagel and possibly also Gordon Muma. In 1966, and this is actually considered his first full score composition. It had visual elements, and I'll mention that in the course of time. So, although by now well recognized among teachers, composers, and performers of new music, the American virtuoso, pianist, and composer David Tudor, born in 1926, died in 1996, is still a neglected figure. I was happy to see him coursing through Lita's slides, but really that's part of my whole point, as we'll see. This is perplexing to explain why still neglected, given that, as a pianist, he pioneered the music of the musical avant-garde, including the US premiere of Pierre Boulez's notoriously difficult Second Piano Sonata. He did this in 1950, and the premiere of John Cage's Silence piece, 4 minutes, 33 seconds, in August of 1952. As a composer, Tudor introduced a new form of electronic composition by constructing his own instruments. He believed that new, object-specific, intrinsically electronic musical material would emerge as each new object or instrument took shape. And here's a quote from an interview, quote, "I try to find out what's there, not to make it do what I want, but to release what's there. The object should teach you what it wants to hear." This principle of making objects reveal their own resonant characteristics was central to David Tudor's electronic composition. So this afternoon, or this morning, I'm going to talk about David Tudor, the composer. My research is based on his archive. His archive is housed at the Getty Research Institute, and it's a vast collection of correspondence, of scores, both scores of composers, Cage, Feldman, European avant-garde, across the board, and then David Tudor's realizations of, in many cases, graphic notations. There are project files, there are 50 tapes, 500 tapes, audio tapes, and much more. I'm going to address 2 of his electronic compositions and then speculate at the end of this talk about why it is that he's still little known and what that might say. I have the pointer, okay. From the time of his first composition, Bandoneon, full score composition, David Tudor was interested in including a visual component in his electronic music. He was interested in the relationship, or sometimes it was a disjunction, it was a juxtaposition between sight and sound. And this interest, fascinatingly, can be traced to meticulous handwritten copies that he made, probably during the 1940s, and that I found in his archive, of essays by Vasily Kandinsky and Arnold Schoenberg on the underlying relationship between music and painting. Now, what you see in this slide are his notes for a piece that he worked on with Billy Kluver and Julie Martin called Island Eye, Island Ear. And I just want to point out some of the things, some of the pairings of terms that indicate this interest in the relationship between sight and sound. So at the top, let's see if this is going to work. I guess this isn't going to work. Okay. At the top, you see sound, fog, visual, kites. Then if we move down in the lower right, amplify, magnify. And then at the lower left, sound beams, sound reflections. So there's this interest in pairing this notion of evocative sound and sight for a piece that was conceived as a collaborative environmental piece during this date spread, and unfortunately never realized, but that he conceived of as using island sounds, processed sounds, and transmitted through parabolic antennae into the island. I want to argue that not only is there this idea of pairing sight and sound, but really that the visual was a collaborative component in Tudor's electronic music. The collaboration is the electronic music with visual elements or objects and with visual artists and performers. Now, what we see here is a setup of David Tudor's electroacoustic sound environment, Rainforest 4. This was the outgrowth of a workshop that he held in New Hampshire in 1973. And let's talk a little bit about what we see. You can see already this was then an installation that was done in Paris in 1976. So what we see, in addition to the little boy, who actually is very helpful because he helps us see the scale of the objects. The objects are very large, mostly suspended from the ceiling, but in some instances standing. I'm going to animate it in just a moment with sound, but first consider the compositional process that went into the making of Rainforest 4. Composers working with Tudor, selected an object and refashioned it as a loudspeaker by attaching a transducer or a contact loudspeaker to it. The object then became a sculptural speaker. The choice of sound material, whether electronic or highly amplified natural sounds, was motivated by the unique set of resonant characteristics or frequencies that each sculpture possesses. So choosing the sculpture, the found object, was quite critical. As the performer prepared the sound material, discoveries were made. Some sounds worked for many objects, others did not. To realize the piece, one had to collaborate with the chosen object, which constrained, in turn, the choice of sounds that could be used. Then, the audience mingled freely with the objects, touching, biting, ear against object, to feel and hear the resonant frequencies. Tudor prepared for his electronic compositions what he called a schematic, or a standard circuit diagram. And I want to show this and just illustrate it briefly, because this is the only thing that existed in the way of a score for something like Rainforest and his other electronic work. The schematic basically maps the process from signal source, which you'll see on the left, to output. And you'll notice that this is Rainforest. You'll see in the middle the object being transduced with the dotted lines in the square, so that the signal source for the speaker is mixed and equalized, that is, the strength of certain frequencies within the signal are adjusted. A voice coil and pickup loudspeaker are attached to the object. You'll see that in the middle. Sound passes through the speaker and through a band pass filter, which allows for the isolating of different frequency ranges, and that can be adjusted during the performance. And that's very important because this is all about live electronic performance. And the mixing allows the control of the levels and positioning of the different sound channels as they are sent to speakers in the performance space. Now, so that you get a kind of first glimpse at the nature of these sculptural speakers, these objects. And remember, I started with this notion of the object. Here we see the video artist, the artist, Bill Viola, on the left. He was part of the first workshop in 1973, and he's performing with Linois Kreiman, taking an object that I imagine was a Viola's invention, and you'll notice how they close their ears, actually, in this case, and bite to feel the sound. And there's that transducer hanging there on the bottom. One more object, this was Bill Viola's oil drum. This was a famous one that's been brought back in subsequent installations. So what we have in Rainforest is a visual sonic collaboration featuring from 4 to 10 performers who create these sculptural speakers, these sound materials, and the visual environment. The performance then unfolds out of this, and we have, as you'll see at the end of my segment, on the spot manipulations of sound through amplification, mixing, other modulation techniques. Audience becomes part of the piece, And the rainforest installation can last anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. Stop it there in the interest of time. You may have noticed among the objects are these toilet bowl floats, and there were certain objects that were known to be resonant and to work, and those came back, and then others were reinvented. But the important comment, actually, let me just leave that blank for a minute. This was an installation that was done in collaboration, the Getty Research Institute with the California Institute for the Arts in May of 2001. And I want to just say a couple of things about the challenges of doing this installation. We wanted to identify a really interesting space. And we wanted it to be outdoors. We thought that would be really very interesting. There were a group of, working with CalArts musicians and people who knew the piece pretty well. And David Tudor had only specified, quote, "The number of instruments and performers should be sufficient to fill any given spatial environment. The audience must be able to move freely through the environment." And that was really the extent of the specifications. And yet to find a space that met those requirements was not an easy task. Outdoors, but what about obtrusive sounds? And where could we find a space that was big enough, a site big enough, that was also enclosed in some way? Inside a museum or gallery? Did the space have high ceilings from which heavy objects could be suspended, as you saw with the object from the long cord at the beginning of that clip? How would we close off a space in a museum from visitors who might be wandering through en route somewhere else? And how would we at the same time maintain a sense of openness? Gradually, we discovered that for any one realization of Rainforest 4, there were many options, but also many unspoken constraints. Our final choice, and what you saw here, was the black box of the CalArts Modular Theater. The interior here, that worked within the performance, and you'll notice, for example, the dramatic lighting that was made possible. Now, this issue of multiple realizations is something I want to talk about briefly, also as it applies to another electronic work of David Tudor, an exploration of sight and sound. In 2001, I discovered the complete version of this piece. It's a 6-monitor, 3-channel video piece about underwater kites called Sea Tales, made in 1983. Colorful kites that could be pulled underwater by the French artist Jackie Matisse a film by Molly Davies, and an electronic score by David Tudor. I'm going to talk about the collaborative process and the idea of not only the collaboration among these three artists, but also with the space of the sea. We had the space of the object. Now, in this case, it's the resonant space of the sea. And Tudor had a long-time interest in deep underwater sea sounds. In our archive, there are many, many audio tapes of whale sounds, porpoise voices, bearded seals, all kinds of underwater sounds. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about the transformation from fixed to live. So here we have the collaborators. On the left, Jackie Matisse, in the middle, of course, David Tudor, and on the right, Molly Davies. Molly Davies and Jackie Matisse invited Tudor to come collaborate with them on this video piece. Rather than creating a separate electronic score, Tudor chose to join them. It was February 1983 in New York, go off to the port city, the city of Nassau in the Bahamas. For 8 days, while Matisse and the divers pulled the kites underwater, and Davies filled, Tudor stayed on the boat and used headphones to monitor his recordings of the underwater sounds. He placed microphones in sealed baby food jars filled with mineral oil and lowered them into the sea. The divers, as they would come up occasionally on the boat, would help him identify the sounds. That's shrimp eating off coral, that's a fish called a grouper, that's a fish called a grunt, because it makes grunt sounds. And here we have the first sketches of what he heard. These were made either during the time of the recording or afterwards as he listened back to the recordings. And you'll see they're shorthands. I want to just point out, and if you look quickly, you'll see references to shrimp, you'll see references to probe, just about 4 lines down on the right. The probe, we're not sure, an underwater microphone, some kind of sonar, a Doppler effect, shrimp, grouper. Then also notice his evaluations. Severe noise. There's a cough. Up there on the left, good, okay. Very important. He's evaluating sounds and deciding he's not going to include some and he's going to include others. There's going to be an editorial process or an editing process that's going to go on. But you see wind, boat passing, all kinds of things like that. Now, what I then tried to do is figure out how the structure was created, how the collaboration actually emerged. Tudor was handed structure and timings from his collaborators. There were 3 pairs of video monitors that were to play 3 edits, edit A, B, and C, that were then repeated but in a different order. For each of the 3 edits, 7 minutes and 31 seconds, Tudor was given 4 timings, and you can see 155, 126, 310, and 1. 4 timings. And he was then to select 12 sounds from his original source tapes and to insert them into these given time slots. So he was really working from the structure of his collaborators. And the important thing about this diagram is that while there are fixed timings that repeat in sequence, what you insert into each of those timings can vary slightly. So it's little bright kites, but those can be different versions of those little bright ones. The filter paper, there's a whole pool of what can be used. Big sailcloth, dark sailcloth, and Tudor then inserting his sounds. Now here are his 12 sounds. Is that as faint out there as it is to me? It's pretty faint? Oh, that's too bad. Yeah, all right. I'm sorry, because it was actually very, very strong. All right, so there are 12 sounds. On the right, he's showing his source tapes, tape 1A, tape 2A, whatever the original tapes were. And then we see listed 12 sounds. And if you study those carefully, basically you can generalize an alternation or a succession of shrimp and probe and shrimp. Shrimp with flag, meaning the flags from the boat dock, or shrimp with probe, with wind, but basically alternating, as he did in the final version, between shrimp, probe, and shrimp. One question I had, given his interest in the visual dimension, is was there any correlation as the types of kites shifted Did the sound shift in any way? Was there any shift? And indeed, once I realized that there was this kind of generalization of shrimp, probe, and shrimp corresponding to 3 basic kite types, I noticed that listening very carefully, there was a barely perceptible shift from shrimp sounds at the beginning, a kind of pecking on the coral, then you hear that Doppler effect. You're not going to hear it all now because I can't play it all now, but a Doppler kind of echoing larger sound, and then a return to the plucking. So there was indeed this very, very subtle shift with the shifting of the kites. Now I'm going to play a very brief excerpt. Yeah, a very brief excerpt, just so you see what this looks like on one video. So just one of the 3 tapes. That's one reason it's going to be so delicate in terms of its sound. Nope, I don't want that. Oh, sorry. Okay, here we go. Are from the divers, which they didn't really want to be. Okay. Interestingly, just as Tudor edited out noise, violent splashes, cough, voice, similarly the kites, it was the same idea of a minimal pool of material and no traces of divers and any other events going on. Okay, finally, what I want to show you is what happened when Tudor transformed this fixed video piece into a live performance. It was originally done in 1983. Its premiere was at the Centre Pompidou in Paris in 1983, but as soon as October of 1983 in Frankfurt at the Theater am Turm, Tudor performed it live by playing back the edits he had prepared for each of the 3 tapes and adding live processing and mixing on the spot, which was not present in the installation version. Seattle's is thus unique in his oeuvre in that it existed as both a fixed installation and a live performance. The remix augments the piece while not going too far afield of the original version, and this sound recording is affected by the fact that it is a monaural recording of what would have been or was a surround sound piece. So you'll see the 6 monitors just gives you a sense of what it looked like as a 6-monitor piece, no presence of Tudor in this shot. Diagonal pairings. I don't know if you could tell, but the way it was done, there are 3 videotapes, and they're paired on a diagonal, rather than linearly, which plays a bit with your perception because you keep reading right to left or up to down, and then you realize, no, the pairs are moving diagonally, which is an interesting aspect. So Tudor continued to perform this piece through the 80s, and sometimes, in addition to the live performance he introduced, they would reconfigure the videos by piling them one on top of the other in what they called a totem version. Now, Lita's already mentioned Tudor's participation in the Once festivals. I'll just say briefly that in '63, Cage and Tudor were guest artists, and Tudor performed Cage's Variations 2, which was a birthday gift from Cage to David Tudor. And this was a fascinating instance where Tudor transformed the piano into an amplified piano, like an electronic instrument, going away from the point dot measured score that Cage provided into something that James Pritchett argues was really his first electronic composition. Okay, let me go back briefly to conclude with this issue of significance. Why is he still less known? Is it in part because of the collaborative nature of his work? As a pianist, he collaborated. As an electronic composer, he collaborated. Did somehow his vision and conception become fused with that of his collaborators? Well, I was excited to learn that on December 4th and 5th of 2010 in Los Angeles, there will be a workshop called David Tudor's Rainforest 4, a sound installation workshop with Casey Anderson. Casey Anderson is a young sound artist. He's a CalArts MFA in composition who now performs with the California Ear Unit, Bang on a Can, a range of festivals. And this is a hands-on workshop with one day introducing Rainforest, building sculptural speakers, the second day experimenting with drivers, objects, and sound sources, and then culminating with an open house where Rainforest 4 is installed in Machine Project, which is a nonprofit community space. And looking on the web, this is basically a storefront in Echo Park, which is a neighborhood of Los Angeles. Well, Rainforest 4 is David Tudor's best known composition. In part, its visual beauty, its sonic beauty, the audience participation, that idea. But I would argue also because it's a piece that David Tudor workshopped. He taught this piece, and it became an oral history of collaboration and performance that has been passed down so that such a workshop can happen. And this, I think, makes us think more about the implications of Tudor's form of electronic collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nancy.